This is not just a story. It is a chilling reminder of how darkness can hide in plain sight. Tonight, we walk through the shadows of a crime that shook families, communities, and law enforcement to the core. I ask you to listen closely, because every detail matters, every silence tells a truth, and at the end, we uncover what really happened. This is a true crime story, and it all began in the quiet town of Yucaipa, California. The desert sun burned hot over Yucaipa on the morning of Thursday, August 14th, 2025. It should have been an ordinary day in a quiet town where life moved at an unhurried pace. But that morning marked the beginning of a tragedy that would ripple across the nation. A story that began as a mother's desperate plea for help would unravel into something darker, something far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. It started with a 911 call. Jake Haro, 41 years old, claimed she had just been the victim of a brazen daylight attack in the parking lot of a Big Five sporting goods store. Her 7-month-old baby boy, Emmanuel, she said, had been stolen from her arms. According to her account, she had pulled into the store's lot, preparing to buy a mouthguard for her older son. Before going inside, she decided to change Emmanuel's diaper in the back of her vehicle. She told police she heard someone approach from behind. A single word, "Hola," was spoken, and then, she claimed, everything went black. When she came to, Emmanuel was gone.
She says she was knocked unconscious by a stranger as she was changing Emmanuel's diaper in this parking lot. And when she woke up, her 7-month-old was gone without a trace.
It's something that just doesn't happen here. Yucaipa, Beaumont, Cabazon, even San Bernardino, as big as the crime rate is there, you don't mess with children.
San Bernardino County Sheriff's deputies rushed to the scene. A mother unconscious, her baby missing without a trace. Panic spread instantly through the quiet community. Amber alerts lit up cell phones across the state. Emmanuel's description was seared into the minds of everyone who read it. A sweet baby boy with a full head of brown hair and wide brown eyes, dressed in a simple black onesie. The parking lot became a hive of activity. Deputies fanned out, scanning every corner, reviewing surveillance cameras, questioning witnesses. But there was nothing. No one had seen an abduction. No one had seen Rebecca attacked. Emmanuel had simply vanished. Rebecca herself appeared shaken when she gave interviews in the hours and days that followed. Cameras captured her tearful pleas. "Please, if you have my baby, bring him back. Take him to a hospital. Drop him at a fire station. Just let him be safe." A bruise under her eye, a deep black mark, added to the image of a mother who had been violently assaulted in broad daylight. But for investigators, something about Rebecca's story didn't sit right. Detectives trained in interview techniques know when details don't align. They noticed inconsistencies in Rebecca's retelling of the supposed abduction. Where exactly had she parked? How long had she been unconscious? Did anyone truly approach her? Each time the questions grew sharper, her answers became hazier. Then, without warning, Rebecca refused to continue cooperating. She stopped talking to investigators altogether. When asked to submit to a polygraph test, she declined. Meanwhile, whispers began to surface from those who knew her. Some claimed that Rebecca had been seen with that same black eye days before Emmanuel's disappearance, at a funeral, in fact. If true, that would mean the injury had nothing to do with the alleged parking lot attack. The narrative of a violent kidnapping was starting to unravel, and so detectives shifted gears. What had begun as a kidnapping case was reclassified as a critical missing child investigation. To the public, it still looked like a frantic search for a kidnapped infant. But behind the scenes, investigators were already considering a much darker possibility. that Emmanuel's disappearance might not involve a stranger at all. At the same time, Jake Haro, 32 years old, and Emmanuel's father became involved. He obtained legal representation almost immediately. His attorney, Vincent Hughes, was no stranger to controversy. Hughes also represented Jake in an unrelated criminal case and now spoke to the media on behalf of both parents. Hughes insisted that Rebecca's sudden silence wasn't a sign of guilt, but of grief. "She's a mother whose baby is missing," he said. "Her emotional state is fragile. That's why she can't continue interviews, not because she has anything to hide." He stressed that the family was cooperating fully, that Jake denied any involvement, and that the community should focus its energy on finding Emmanuel, not casting suspicion on the parents. But investigators weren't convinced. As the days passed, the case consumed San Bernardino County. Sheriff's deputies, detectives, volunteers, and media crews descended on the Haro family's property in Cabazon, about 30 miles from the Big Five store where Rebecca claimed Emmanuel had been taken. The Haro home was an unassuming property, a yard with scattered children's toys, a swing swaying in the hot desert wind, a small bicycle propped against a fence. But to investigators, it was a potential crime scene. Multiple search warrants were served. Detectives combed through the single-story house and detached barn, scouring for evidence. Helicopters circled overhead, filming from above as K-9 units padded across the dusty yard. Some were trained to detect human scent, others to detect cadavers. Inside, investigators reportedly lifted floorboards, searching for traces of blood or other evidence that might tell the story the parents would not. At the same time, digital forensics teams were at work. Jake and Rebecca had surrendered their phones to law enforcement. Investigators also seized 2 iPads, 3 Xbox consoles, and the family's vehicle. These devices, filled with texts, searches, GPS data, often reveal what words and actions cannot. According to crime reporter Andy Alice, the digital trail was pivotal. It provided leads that may have directly contributed to what came next. Investigators also secured footage from around the Big Five sporting goods store. One liquor store across the street had cameras trained on the parking lot. The footage showed Rebecca falling to the ground, consistent with her story of collapsing. But one crucial detail was missing. No baby could be seen in her arms, and no stranger appeared on camera approaching her. That gap was devastating to her version of events. The suspicion was no longer whispered, it was shouted. The story of a stranger's abduction was collapsing under the weight of evidence. And still, baby Emmanuel was nowhere to be found. The days dragged on. Emmanuel's photo spread online, on news broadcasts, and on posters taped to storefronts. The community lit candles, tied balloons to fences, and prayed for the baby's safe return. But hope was rapidly being replaced with dread. Detectives worked tirelessly, piecing together the puzzle. They had parents who refused to cooperate, evidence that contradicted their story, and an infant who had vanished into thin air. By the end of that week, investigators were ready to act. And what they did next would shock not just Cabazon, not just Yucaipa, but the entire nation. By the morning of Friday, August 22, 2025, a week had passed since Rebecca Haro's frantic 911 call. That morning, San Bernardino County Sheriff Shannon Dykes stood before cameras, the weight of the investigation heavy in his voice. His words were careful, deliberate, but devastating. "We have probable cause to believe that baby Emmanuel Haro is deceased." The announcement sent shockwaves through the crowd of reporters, neighbors, and family members gathered outside the sheriff's department. For a week, the public had clung to hope that Emmanuel might still be alive, hidden somewhere by a stranger. Sheriff Dykes' statement crushed that fragile hope, and then came the bombshell. Rebecca Haro and Jake Haro had been arrested. That Friday morning, deputies arrived at the Haro property in Cabazon with handcuffs and warrants. Both Rebecca and Jake were taken into custody without incident. Their mugshots, released later that day, told a haunting story of their own. Rebecca, her face pale and hollow, stared into the camera with a mixture of exhaustion and defeat. Jake, expression blank, looked almost detached, as if he were already bracing himself for the storm to come. The charges were staggering. Both parents faced murder, torture, assault on a child causing death, and falsifying a police report. As details emerged, so too did the Haro's troubled history. Jake Haro, it turned out, was already awaiting trial on 14 separate charges related to child sexual abuse. The accusations stretched back years, involving not only Emmanuel's older siblings, but also other minors. Prosecutors described him as a predator who used his position as a father to exploit and harm. Rebecca, for her part, had also been investigated in the past. According to court documents, she had been accused of child abuse involving her older children. Those cases had wound their way through the courts, but now investigators believed her role in Emmanuel's disappearance connected directly to that history of abuse. Neighbors and community members, once sympathetic to the parents, began to see the story differently. Whispers that had once been cautious now became loud condemnations. How could they? How could any parent do this to their own child? Behind the scenes, investigators laid out the evidence that led to the arrests. First was the inconsistency of Rebecca's injury. That black eye she had paraded before cameras, which she claimed was the result of a violent abduction attempt. Multiple witnesses stated they had seen her with the same bruise days earlier, long before she reported Emmanuel missing. Then there was the surveillance footage. If Rebecca's version of events had been true, there should have been clear evidence of someone approaching her, someone taking Emmanuel. Instead, the cameras showed her collapsing alone, empty-handed, and perhaps most damning of all, the digital trail. Investigators had recovered messages, search histories, and location data from the family's devices that painted a chilling picture. One that prosecutors would later argue proved the Haro's involvement in Emmanuel's death. Although authorities did not immediately reveal Emmanuel's exact cause of death or where his body was, Sheriff Dykes made clear that evidence pointed to only one conclusion: Emmanuel was gone, and his parents were responsible. For the residents of Yucaipa and Cabazon, grief quickly turned to outrage. Vigils that had been meant as hopeful gatherings transformed into solemn memorials. People lit candles not for Emmanuel's safe return, but for his soul. A baby who had only just entered the world, who should have had a lifetime of birthdays ahead, was instead mourned by strangers who had never met him. One woman at a vigil clutched her own infant to her chest and whispered through tears, "How could a mother do this?" The community's heartbreak was echoed across the nation. Emmanuel's story had become national news, and millions of Americans followed every update. From small-town diners to big-city office buildings, people shook their heads in disbelief at the cruel betrayal of a child by his parents. And through it all, one truth remained constant. Emmanuel was gone. There was no miracle rescue, no stranger caught on camera, no safe return. A baby who should have been celebrating his first steps in just a few months was instead the victim of unimaginable cruelty. Rebecca and Jake's arrests brought some measure of justice, but they could never bring Emmanuel back. As the nation absorbed the shocking details of Emmanuel's case, one question lingered in every conversation, every headline, every vigil. How could this have been prevented? Child welfare advocates pointed to systemic failures, past abuse allegations that should have raised stronger red flags, gaps in protective services, a legal system that too often returns children to unsafe homes. For ordinary Americans, the lesson was more personal: to stay vigilant, to recognize the signs of abuse, and to never assume that tragedy could never happen in my neighborhood. Emmanuel's story is a haunting reminder that sometimes the greatest dangers children face come not from strangers in parking lots, but from within their own homes. And so, as the candles burned and the community grieved, one plea rose above all others: let Emmanuel's short life not be in vain. Let it awaken us to the urgent need to protect the most vulnerable among us, because in the end, this story was never about a kidnapping. It was about trust betrayed, innocence stolen, and the desperate need for a society to do better. For Emmanuel and for every child like him.